This is the second video for HumCore 2301, and in this video I'm going to talk about the history of newspapers in modern Japan, and briefly I'm going to talk about government efforts to control the content of newspapers. The history of what we would consider newspaper reporting predates the modern period in Japan. It can be traced back to the 19th century and to these single sheet leaflets known as kawaraban that were often produced, or broadsheets that were often produced in the aftermath of some kind of newsworthy event and were placed in various public locations for people to read. Here we have a report of the aftermath of an earthquake, outlining the damage due to the earthquake. These kawaraban reported news, but they're different from newspapers in that they weren't produced on a regular basis, and there's no financial component. They weren't sold to subscribers. There's no advertising. Sometimes they were produced by official entities, sometimes by unofficial entities. Now, what we think of as newspapers first appear in Japan in the 1850s and 1860s, and these are not produced by Japanese, but by foreign residents to the concessions in the open ports like Yokohama and Kobe. These are businessmen, government representatives. They are used to reading newspapers in their home countries, and so they decide to start publishing newspapers for their local expat communities in these concessions. These newspapers are in French or English, mostly in English actually. But the Japanese publishers, book producers, become aware of them and start to produce their own newspapers shortly thereafter. So in the 1860s and 1870s and in the early 1880s, you start to have the publication of domestically produced Japanese language newspapers. And these newspapers are broadly divided into two categories. The first category is O Shimbun, or big newspaper. And these newspapers are called big newspapers because by publishing standards of Japan at the time, the single sheet format the format is fairly large. These newspapers are produced on a daily basis. They are sold. People subscribe to them. They're sold on street corners. So in that sense, they're very much like a modern newspaper. The way that they're different, though, is that the focus is less on reporting news and more on political commentary or editorial commentary on politics. And this is because in this period, in the 1860s, 1870s, and in the beginning of the 1880s, the Japanese Constitution had yet to be promulgated, and there was a lot of interest in discussing what kind of constitution might be appropriate for Japan, what kind of political system might be put in place in Japan. And so these newspapers became a venue to promote different political philosophies. These newspapers were targeted largely at elite, highly educated readers, and therefore they didn't provide any reading aids. They were hard to read, and it was assumed that the typical reader would be educated enough to read difficult text with lots of Chinese characters and lots of newfangled modern terminology. The other category of newspaper is the the koshinbun, or a small newspaper. These newspapers were comparatively small by publishing standards of the day. Here is an image of a woman reading the Kanayomi Shimbun, and that would be translated as the phonetic syllabary newspaper. And so that's one important feature of these newspapers, is that they contain lots of reading aids. Chinese characters would be glossed with pronunciation aids, and most of the text would actually be in the phonetic syllabary. So they're easy to read. And in terms of content, they mostly deal with local news events. So you get reporting on local crimes, murders, burglaries. You also get lots of gossip about local celebrities, geisha, kabuki actors. And you get the beginnings of what we think of as serialized fiction. These were often multi-part accounts of sensational crimes with a lot of focus on violence and sex and sort of the brutal execution of these criminals once they've been apprehended. So they're kind of salacious. It's very salacious material. The situation changed starting in the second half of the 1880s and the 1890s. And one catalyst for this change is that in 1889, the Japanese Constitution is promulgated, and the debates that are being bandied about in the large newspapers are largely settled. Another inflection point is the Sino-Japanese War. And so what you get then is basically an integration of the large newspapers and the small newspapers. The editorial component of the large newspaper is integrated into the news reporting component of the small newspaper. And as I mentioned, the first Sino-Japanese War, which is a conflict between Japan and the Qing Empire, 1894 to 1895, becomes a driver of readership in that people turn to newspapers to find out what is happening in this conflict. And they want to find out what's happening on the front lines. And so newspapers start to respond to that need. They start to dispatch reporters to the Korean Peninsula where most of the fighting is happening. And in turn, readers become habituated to looking at newspapers to find out what's going on. This trend continues in the first decade of the 20th century with the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Here we see a newspaper with a headline that is celebrating a naval victory of the Japanese forces over Russian forces. And this is very typical of a very early 20th century Japanese newspaper. You can see it's very text heavy. There's a small schematic image in the lower left-hand corner, but there are no photographs yet in a newspaper, or there are very few photographs. So in the beginning of the 20th century, newspaper publishers start to innovate in a variety of ways to try to attract more readers and to make their publications more profitable. And some of these strategies include creating new content, for example, starting to cover sports, starting to cover lifestyle issues, starting to cover cultural issues, also setting up foreign offices so that they can report more international news. There's a lot of investment in human resources, expanding the staff of reporters, editors, page designers, and also with the integration of photographs, hiring photographers. Another strategy is to establish exclusive contracts with popular writers, and actually these serialized novels that became increasingly long and typically ran about 6 months became a real selling point for newspapers, and people often subscribed to newspapers so that they could read work by their favorite author. Newspapers also expanded their delivery schedule, adding evening editions as a service to loyal subscribers. And then there was a big investment in new technology. One of the main technological innovations that really reduced the price of newspapers was the introduction of offset printing. Offset printing involves the transfer of the text from the printing roll to a rubber blanket to a rubber surface, then from the rubber surface to the sheet of paper. And it's a much more efficient, faster means of reproducing printed material. And then the other big innovation is the introduction of halftone photographic reproduction. Halftone photographic reproduction basically means translating a photographic image to a sequence of gray, black, and white dots. And then these gray, black, and white dots can be using offset printing, then can be transferred to a page of newspaper. And this makes it possible very cheaply to produce fairly high quality reproductions of photographic images. So as a result, of all of these innovations and investments, newspaper readership explodes in Japan, and by 1930, on a daily basis, about 1 million newspapers are published, and this is for a population of 65 million people, so that means one newspaper for every 6.5 people. And that doesn't even account for total readership, because it's assumed that every newspaper or most newspapers were read by more than one person. So it's estimated that a newspaper could be read by up to 12 people. So newspaper readership becomes ubiquitous. It becomes integrated into the daily fabric of people's lives. And as a result, the state becomes very interested in trying to control the content of newspapers. And so over the course of the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, you have a sequence of legal codes that are introduced that become increasingly fixated on controlling the content of newspapers and establishing various bureaucratic oversight groups that will oversee and censor the content of newspapers. And one of the main techniques for this is the use of redaction symbols. And so here you see a very sort of extreme, parodic example of that. The redaction symbols are the little circles, and they cover different written symbols. And so this is a way of excising content that was deemed problematic, and problematic material could be anything from criticism of the emperor, criticism of government policies, anything that was seen as advocacy of a rebellious outlook, and anything that was thought to be injurious to public morals. And the interesting thing about these redaction symbols is A, they make clear to the reader that something has been left cut out, and B, they almost make it possible in a weird way for the reader to decipher what is being redacted. So these bureaucracies are put into place in the beginning of the 20th century, and one of their goals is to control the content of newspapers, but another goal becomes the idea of integrating propaganda material into newspapers. So that there's an effort to make newspapers an arm of the state propaganda machine. And so control of newspapers involves censoring content that is seen as problematic, but also including content that is seen as promoting the interests of the state. And this becomes especially pronounced in the 1930s, especially after the Japanese invasion of China. And one of the most sensational examples of that is a series of articles that appeared in the Nichi Nichi Shimbun, or the Daily News of Tokyo, which was a major national daily, which recounted a contest between two Japanese officers to see who could decapitate 100 enemy combatants more quickly. And so this was this Hyakunin Giri Kyoso, or this competition to decapitate 100 people. And so this contest was reported in extremely affirming terms. It was presented as an admirable example of a modern manifestation of the old warrior spirit. And so I think that this shows the way that a work like Miyamoto Musashi, which is a complete affirmation of a kind of imagined notion of what the warrior spirit is in Japan, was then mapped onto coverage of wartime content. And so these two warriors, or these two soldiers, used samurai-style swords to perform the decapitation.